quiet hum of the neon sign above the Casablanca diner was the only sound breaking the nighttime silence of Tacoma. The air, humid and saturated with the smell of the salty sea and pine trees, enveloped the city like a heavy blanket. Inside, under the dim light of the lamps reflected in the red plastic tabletops, sat a young man. He was handsome, this could not be denied. Classic features, a straight nose, thick dark hair falling onto his forehead, but there was something in his eyes deep, almost black, that made one's gaze linger a moment too long. They held not melancholy, not sadness, but a kind of all-consuming, insatiable emptiness, as if he was looking not at the world around him, but through it, into some other, invisible reality. His name was Ted Bundy. To the diner's patrons and his classmates at the University of Washington, he was a promising psychology student, a charming, somewhat shy guy with a brilliant future. He knew how to win people over. His smile seemed genuine, and his manner of listening so attentive that people were ready to reveal their soul's most intimate secrets to him. He was one of the pack of prosperous young people, striving toward a bright tomorrow, caught up in the winds of change of the 60s. But at night, when the city slept, this shell began to crack at the seams. Inside him, a storm raged that neither law school nor the approving glances of professors, nor the smiles of pretty co-eds could quell. He was a creature of darkness, a child of moonlight that does not warm, but only casts long, distorted shadows. His past was shrouded in mystery, which he carefully hid. He grew up in Philadelphia, believing that his strict, religious mother was his sister, and that his real mother, the woman he called Mom, was actually his grandmother. The truth, cruel and humiliating, was revealed to him by accident in the form of a birth certificate, and it shattered his fragile, still-forming world into pieces. He, so proud, so ambitious, turned out to be illegitimate, a stain on the reputation of a respectable family. This lie, this feeling of an initial, fundamental deception, became the crack through which the darkness seeped into his soul. He compensated for this with a fierce drive for success, for recognition. He was smart, very smart, but his intellect was like a double-edged sword. On one side, it opened doors to the best universities. On the other, it served to justify his growing contempt for those who were dumber than him. He felt chosen, standing above the crowd, above these simple, trusting people, whose lives seemed so primitive, so boring to him. And then Stephanie came into his life. She was from that very right family he so dreamed of. Rich, beautiful, refined, she embodied everything he was deprived of. He fell in love with her with the obsession only he was capable of. She became for him not just a girlfriend, but a symbol, a key to the world he so desperately wanted to enter. But their relationship was doomed. Stephanie, in the end, broke it off, realizing that behind the brilliant facade lurked something alarming, elusive, something she could not and would not accept. He was rejected again, and this time by the one he had placed on a pedestal. The wound was not just painful, it was fatal to the fragile construct he had built around himself. The world he was trying to conquer had rejected him once more. And in the depths of his being, in that very emptiness that stared out from his eyes, something clicked. If he could not possess this ideal, this purity that Stephanie embodied, then he would destroy it. He would prove his power, his superiority over those who thought themselves better than him, his hatred for the world that had rejected him, and his painful attraction to women who reminded him of Stephanie, her type, her style, twisted into one tight, deadly knot. And so, on these quiet Tacoma nights, when the moon, cold and indifferent, sailed over the sleeping city, Ted Bundy went hunting. He shed the skin of the successful student, like a snake shedding its old skin, and turned into something else. He got into his beat-up Volkswagen Beetle, a car that would later become a symbol of horror, and cruised the streets, campuses, and parks. His eyes, once empty, now lit up with a predatory, keen gleam. He was searching, stalking. He was a chameleon, a master of disguise. Today, he was a student with a cast on his arm, helplessly dropping books near the library, so a kind soul would help him carry them to his car. Tomorrow, a charming stranger in a trendy cafe, spouting clever phrases and compliments. The day after, a firefighter, a policeman, an authoritative figure inspiring unconditional trust. He approached his victims not like a maniac from a thriller, but like one of the guys. He spoke their language, smiled his famous, disarming smile. He was a shadow that could take any form, penetrate any cracks in human trust. He studied them, their habits, their roots, their weaknesses. He was as patient as a spider weaving its web. And then the moment came. The quiet click of a car door, a short conversation, and disappearance. A girl who had just been laughing, making plans for the future, reading a book in the park, would vanish into thin air. There was no scream, no struggle, no traces. Only silence, a deafening, ringing silence, broken only by the distant noise of cars or the rustle of leaves. He took them to his places of power, abandoned shacks in the mountains, remote wooded areas known only to him, and there, under the canopy of ancient trees, in complete isolation from the world, the final, terrible scene of his drama played out. He didn't just kill, he asserted his absolute power over life and death. He erased them, these bright, beautiful, vibrant girls, like erasing a mistake from a sheet of paper. In his twisted logic, this was an act of creation. He created emptiness, a shadow, which was more familiar to him than life itself. And in the morning, he was Ted Bundy again. He went to lectures, joked with friends, worked at the crisis center, where relatives of the missing girls often turned. He was in the very thick of the tragedy he himself was creating. He gave advice, comforted, nodded with a sympathetic look. And all this time, inside him, a triumphant glee raged. He was smarter than everyone. He was a ghost who could dance at his victims' funerals, and no one even suspected. This was his secret life, his dark double that came out for a walk under the cover of night. And with every disappearance, with every new shadow joining his grim collection, the emptiness inside him was briefly filled, but it was an insatiable monster, and soon it needed a new victim, a new portion of life to feed its dead soul. This is how the legend began. The legend of the man Riddle, the respectable neighbor who was a monster, of the shadow that slid under the moon, leaving no traces but silence and an all-pervading, soul-chilling fear. Chapter 2. Disappearances. The autumn of 1974 in Seattle was particularly rainy and gray. The leaves, soaked and darkened, carpeted the lawns of the University of Washington campus like a giant, wet watercolor. Students, huddled in raincoats and jackets, hurried about their business, their laughter and conversations drowned in the steady noise of the rain. This was a place where life was bustling, where future doctors, engineers, and artists were building their dreams. But in this damp fall semester, anxiety began to slowly but surely seep onto the campus. It started with Donna Manson on the evening of March 12. She went to a jazz concert on campus and didn't return. Donna was a bright, sociable girl studying anthropology. Her disappearance was written off as carelessness, maybe running off with a new boyfriend. That happened, but anxiety, quiet, and still almost inaudible, began to sound in the hearts of her friends. Then, on March 31, Susan Elaine Rancourt disappeared. She went to the library in the evening and vanished. Susan was a conscientious student, responsible and reliable. Her sudden disappearance no longer had a simple explanation. Her family sounded the alarm, and on campus, people began to talk about a strange pattern. Young, attractive girls were disappearing, and it always happened in the evening or at night. Spring brought no relief. On April 17, Roberta Kathleen Parks disappeared. She wasn't from the university, but was visiting a friend. They had an argument in the evening. Roberta left to cool off and vanished into the night. Her disappearance erased boundaries. The danger had moved beyond the campus, spreading throughout Seattle. Anxiety turned to panic. Newspapers ran screaming headlines. Who is kidnapping the Seattle co-eds? Television news showed photographs of smiling, vibrant girls and anchors with serious faces urged the public to be vigilant. A curfew was imposed on campus. Women walked in groups, afraid to go out alone after dark. The air grew thick with fear. Every unfamiliar glance, every shadow in an alley seemed like a threat. And Ted Bundy was right in the thick of this fear. He was working as a volunteer at the crisis center that had been set up to help search for the missing girls. He answered phones, took messages, and mapped out possible routes. He was helpful, active, full of sympathy. People saw him as a rock, a young man who wasn't afraid to take on such a heavy burden. He sat at a desk, cluttered with photos of Donna, Susan, Roberta, and his fingers slowly traced their smiling faces. He knew them, not as friends or family did. He knew the last, frozen terror in their eyes, their last breath. And while chaos and despair reigned around him inside, a strange, perverse sense of satisfaction raged. He was the puppeteer, and the whole city was his marionette. He pulled the strings, and they danced a dance of horror and panic. He looked at the parents, crazed with grief, at the crying friends, at the confused policemen, and he was filled with a sense of his own power. They were looking for a ghost, a shadow, and he sat among them, drinking coffee and advising them on how to catch himself. It was the most refined, most cruel of his games. One evening, when the center was especially crowded, the mother of one of the missing girls approached him. A woman with a haggard face and eyes full of tears put her hand on his arm. "Thank you, Ted," she whispered. "Thank you for helping us. You have no idea how important this is." He looked at her, and a faint smile flickered on his lips. His eyes met hers for a moment, and perhaps a spark of that soul-chilling triumph burning inside him flashed within them. But the woman was too absorbed in her grief to notice anything. "I'll do everything in my power, ma'am," he said in a quiet, confident voice. And he did. He was an indispensable helper. He remembered details, built theories, analyzed maps. He was a psychologist. He understood how a criminal thinks. And he truly understood because he was one. His advice was both help and a way to lead the investigation down a false trail, to divert suspicion from himself. He was the snake that had warmed itself on the chest at the very heart of the tragedy. Meanwhile, the disappearances continued. On May 14, Brenda Carroll Ball disappeared. On June 1, Janice Ann Ott. On July 14, Georgine Hawkins. The list grew. The police were at a dead end. There were no witnesses, no evidence, no motives. The criminal was a ghost. He came from nowhere and went nowhere, leaving behind only a ringing emptiness and escalating terror. Fear became a part of everyday life in Seattle. Women bought pepper spray, signed up for self-defense classes. Fathers walked their daughters all the way to the university doors. Rumors spread through the city about a mysterious, well-built blonde man, about a Volkswagen Beetle seen in different parts of the city on the nights of the disappearances. But these were just rumors, vague and not leading anywhere, and Ted Bundy was already planning his exit. He felt the net closing in around him. The police, though bumbling, might eventually stumble upon the right thread. His dark thirst wasn't abating, it was only burning hotter. But Seattle was becoming too hot for him. He decided to change locations. His gaze fell on Utah, on Colorado. New places, new victims, new hunting grounds. He packed his things, said goodbye to his colleagues at the crisis center, saying he was leaving to continue his studies. They shook his hand, thanked him for his help, wished him luck. They saw him off as a hero, as one of those who tried to fight the darkness. They couldn't possibly imagine they were seeing off the darkness itself. His Volkswagen pulled onto the highway, leaving the panic-stricken Seattle behind. The interior smelled of old carpet, gasoline, and something else, a faint, sweetish smell of death that had soaked into the seat upholstery. Ted Bundy looked at the road, rushing under the wheels, and smiled. His game continued. He was a shadow, free and elusive. And ahead of him awaited new cities, new lives to be turned to dust and emptiness. Chapter 3. Cracks in the persona, the move to Salt Lake City, was Ted's attempt to start with a clean slate. Seattle was behind him, along with its growing notoriety as a city terrorized by an unknown maniac. Here in Utah, he was just the new guy in town, a law graduate student with brilliant recommendations. He rented a small apartment near the university, got a job, and quickly blended into local society. His charm, as always, worked flawlessly. But the dark double, lurking beneath the mask, had no intention of resting. The quiet, respectable streets of Salt Lake City, with their Mormon strictness and measured pace of life, became his new playing field. The hunt resumed. On October 18, 1974, Nancy Baird Wilcox disappeared. She left home to meet friends and never returned. On October 31, Halloween, Debbie Lynn Kent disappeared. She was at a school party, went out to her car in the parking lot, and vanished into the night. She was only found many years later. The atmosphere in Salt Lake City began to change. If the fear in Seattle was loud and hysterical, here it was quiet, muffled, like creeping footsteps in an empty house. People began locking doors they hadn't locked before. Parents watched their daughters with growing anxiety. Ted Bundy felt in his element. He studied the new city, its habits, its vulnerable spots. He was a predator adapting to a new environment. He became the shadow again, sliding through the night streets, invisible and omnipotent. But it was here, in Utah, that he made his first mistake, or rather, not him, his dark half. That insatiable thirst that pushed him toward increasingly audacious crimes. On the evening of November 8, 1974, he entered a store in a shopping mall. He approached the counter where hosiery was sold and asked for help from a young sales clerk named Carol Daranch. He was neatly dressed and spoke politely. He introduced himself as Officer Roseland and said there was a thief operating in their store. He needed her help to identify a suspect who had been detained in the parking lot. Carol, an 18-year-old girl, believed him. His manner of speaking was convincing, authoritative. She went outside with him to his Volkswagen. He opened the front passenger door and asked her to get in. And then something in his eyes, in the sharp movement of his hand, made her internal alarm bell turn into a deafening siren. This wasn't the look of a policeman. It was the look of a predator. She tried to break free, screamed. He grabbed her, tried to put handcuffs on her, but she fought back, screamed louder. Her screams attracted attention. Someone from the store rushed out. Ted, realizing the plan had failed, pushed her away and jumped into the car. The Volkswagen screeched its tires and sped off into the night. Carol Daranch survived. She was in shock, bruised, but alive. And most importantly, she could describe her attacker. Young, handsome, with dark hair. And the car, an olive green Volkswagen Beetle. This was the first link, the first crack in his flawless facade. But Ted didn't stop. His demon demanded a new victim. Just a few hours after the failure with Carol, he appeared in a residential neighborhood nearby. He entered a house where several students lived. He went down to the basement, into the bedroom of 18-year-old Debbie Smith. He stood over her bed with a crowbar in his hand and watched the sleeping girl. Something woke Debbie, maybe a creaking floorboard, maybe a sixth sense. She opened her eyes and saw a dark figure above her. She screamed. Her scream woke the other residents of the house. Footsteps and voices were heard. Ted, like a shadow, slipped out of the room and disappeared into the darkness. He had failed again. For the first time, his victims had survived and could describe him. The Salt Lake City police now knew they were looking for a young man with a Volkswagen. The net was beginning to tighten. Meanwhile, in Colorado, disappearances were happening. On January 12, 1975, Karen E. Campbell disappeared from the campus of Colorado State University. She was found later in the woods, murdered. The investigation, following hot leads, led to an olive green Volkswagen Beetle seen near the campus. The car's license plate was recorded. The police in Utah and Colorado began exchanging information, similar modus operandi, similar suspect descriptions, the same car model. The pieces of the puzzle began to form a single picture. August 16, 1975, became a turning point. A police patrol in Salt Lake City spotted an olive green Volkswagen Beetle driving with a broken taillight. They pulled it over. Behind the wheel was a smiling, polite young man named Ted Bundy. He presented his license, acted calmly. The police ran the car's plate. It matched the number from the Karin Campbell case. They asked him to step out of the car. In the Volkswagen's trunk, the police found a strange set of items: a rope, a mask, a crowbar, handcuffs, plastic bags. It was a hunter's kit, a hunter of people. Ted Bundy was arrested on suspicion of kidnapping. In his pocket, they found the credit card of one of the missing girls from Colorado. That evening, when the jail cell door slammed shut behind him, the shadow was finally caught. It seemed the nightmare was over. But in reality, it was just entering a new, even darker phase. The game was now being played by different rules, and Ted Bundy, with his brilliant mind and manic belief in his own superiority, was ready to turn the courtroom into his new stage. Chapter 4. The courtroom masquerade, the jail cell in Salt Lake City, was a world reduced to a few square meters. Gray walls, a bars instead of one of them, a hard bunk, a small table. For a man accustomed to freedom of movement, to power over space and time, this should have been torture. But Ted Bundy did not break. He adapted. The prison became a new arena for him, where he could demonstrate his intellectual superiority. He refused a state-appointed lawyer and decided to defend himself. This was a strategic move. He understood that a trial is not only a search for truth, but also a spectacle. And he intended to become its director and lead actor. He spent days and nights in the law library, studying laws, procedural rules, and case law. His mind, sharp and cunning, greedily absorbed information. He built his defense, wrote motions, and prepared for cross-examinations. His first trial was for the attempted kidnapping of Carol Daranch. The courtroom was packed. People had come to see the man. The newspapers had already dubbed the campus killer. They expected to see a monster, a creature with fangs and claws. But before them stood a well-groomed young man in a strict suit. He was calm, collected, almost aristocratic. He took notes, asked questions in a polite, confident voice. When Carol Daranch took the stand, he looked at her with his dark, piercing eyes. He didn't look threatening. He looked interested. He asked her questions about that evening, clarifying details that seemed insignificant. He tried to confuse her, to find inconsistencies in her testimony. His manner was not aggressive, but rather condescending, as if he were a professor and she were a negligent student. But Carol was firm. She looked at him and recognized him. She recognized his eyes, his voice, that moment of animal terror when he grabbed her arm. Her testimony was clear and irrefutable. Ted was not embarrassed. He continued his game. He called witnesses, trying to prove he was elsewhere that night. He built complex, convoluted alibis. He played cat and mouse with the investigators, the jury, the judge himself. But the evidence was against him, and the witness testimony, and his own behavior, in which arrogance, almost contempt for the proceedings, sometimes showed through. He thought he was smarter than everyone in that room, and perhaps he was. But his intellect was his curse. He couldn't simply submit, admit defeat. He had to fight, to prove his superiority, even when everything was against him. In the end, the jury delivered the verdict, guilty. He was sentenced to prison time. It was his first official loss, but for Ted, it wasn't a defeat, only the first round in a long battle. He filed an appeal. He was confident he could outplay the system. While he sat in jail, awaiting trial on more serious charges, the murders in Colorado, a strange metamorphosis occurred. Fame came to him. Not the fame he had dreamed of in his youth, the fame of a lawyer or politician, but a dark, gothic fame as a serial killer. Newspapers wrote about him. His face appeared on television. Women sent him letters, confessing their love. His intellect, his charm, his mystery attracted them like moths to a flame. He became a cult figure, and this fed his ego, his belief in his own chosenness. He wasn't just a criminal, he was a star, even if a star from the underworld. In prison, he continued to study. He studied law, psychology, criminology. He helped other prisoners write appeals, gave advice. He became the prison lawyer. And all this time, he planned. He planned his escape, because prison was only a temporary delay for him. He could not accept that his will would be broken, that his freedom would be limited by these gray walls. The first escape was almost comical. He was allowed to work in a courtroom, helping to classify legal documents. One day, in June 1977, he simply walked out of the room, went down the stairs, and disappeared into the city. He was free for 6 days. 6 days when all of Salt Lake City froze in fear again. But he was caught. He was hungry, exhausted, and made the mistake of returning to his old neighborhood. But he didn't give up. He began planning a second escape. More daring, more desperate. He lost 15 kilograms, squeezing through a hole in the ceiling of his cell that he had made with a nail file. He crawled through a ventilation shaft, overcame several grates, and found himself on the prison roof. From there, he jumped to the ground and vanished into the night. This time, he was free. Truly, he had stolen money, stolen credit cards. He boarded a bus and left Utah. His path led east to Florida. He was the shadow, the ghost, elusive and dangerous once more. His dark double was free again, and this time, his appetites were to be satisfied with double the force. Florida, with its hot, humid climate, noisy college towns, and resort-like relaxation, became the stage for his final and most terrible act. Chapter 5: The Florida Frenzy, Tallahassee, Florida. January 1978. The air here was thick, humid, and heavy, even at night. It didn't invigorate like the Pacific breezes of Seattle. It enveloped you like a wet sheet, bringing with it the smell of blooming magnolia, swamp decay, and something putrid hiding in the shade of century-old oaks draped with Spanish moss. For Ted Bundy, this climate was like a reflection of his inner state, a hothouse where his demons grew and mutated at an unprecedented rate. His escape from Colorado had been a bold, almost incredible trick, confirming his belief in his own chosenness. The system, those stupid, limited people, couldn't hold him. He was free as a bird, but it was a bird of prey, a scavenger, whose freedom meant only one thing: the resumption of the hunt. He settled in a cheap motel under the name Chris Hagen. He had stolen documents, a little money, and an unquenchable, seething rage inside. The months spent in confinement had not tamed him. They had only fueled his hunger. He felt time was against him. His face was now known to everyone, from housewives to federal agents. His photo was in every post office. He was the most wanted man in America. This public awareness made his old methods too risky. He could no longer pretend to be a helpless student with a cast. He needed a new approach, more direct, more brutal. Desperation and rage began to outweigh his innate caution and love for intellectual games. On the evening of January 14, 1978, on the eve of his 32nd birthday, Ted Bundy, filled with alcohol and hatred for the whole world, drove to the area around Florida State University's college. It was a place teeming with young, carefree lives, what he was deprived of, and what he so desperately wanted to destroy. He watched the co-eds returning from parties, laughing, living their primitive, happy lives. Every laugh was a slap in the face to him. Every glance that didn't notice him was an insult. He entered the Chi Omega sorority house. The door was unlocked. He walked down the hallway like a ghost, listening to the sounds behind the doors: music, conversations, laughter. He was a shadow in the very heart of youth and cheer. His victims that night were two young women, Lisa Levy and Margaret Bowman. They were beautiful, smart, full of plans. Lisa had just returned from a run. Margaret was getting ready for bed. He burst into their room like a hurricane, bringing not just death, but inhuman cruelty. His attack held the fury of a cornered animal, an outburst of all the hatred accumulated over months of confinement. He beat them, mutilated them, committed acts of such violence upon them that even seasoned criminologists later shuddered. He left their mangled bodies in a room that just minutes before had been their safe haven. But his thirst was not quenched. The rage only grew. He left the Chi Omega house and, like a sleepwalker, headed to another student residence nearby. There he found another victim, Kathy Kleiner. He broke into her room, but this time his victim miraculously survived. She fought back. Her screams raised the alarm. Wounded, but still full of adrenaline, he disappeared into the night. His last victim that bloody night was 12-year-old Kimberly Leach. He abducted her from her own home while she slept. Her small, fragile body was found only a few weeks later. That night in Tallahassee, known as the Sorority House Massacre, was the apex of his career of horror. This was not the cold, calculating hunter he had been in Seattle. This was a creature possessed by demons, spewing out all the darkness that had accumulated inside for years. He had crossed a line beyond which there was no room for games, for disguise, for illusions. And then morning came. Tallahassee awoke to the news of the nightmare. The city was plunged into shock and panic. The police were baffled. The attacks were so brutal that investigators initially couldn't believe it was the work of one man. But Ted Bundy could no longer think clearly. He was wounded, exhausted. His car was wrecked, and his face was on the front page of every newspaper in Florida. He wandered the city like a ghost, buying food and alcohol at all-night stores, feeling the walls of the world closing in on him. On February 9, 1978, late in the evening, he was spotted by patrol officer David Lee. Bundy was driving a stolen Volkswagen. Lee, showing incredible vigilance, became suspicious. He stopped the car. When he approached the window, he saw an emaciated, nervous man with a wild look in his eyes. Bundy tried to flee, but Lee was alert. After a short but fierce struggle on the roadside, Ted Bundy, the man legend, the man shadow, was finally and irrevocably arrested. In the trunk of the stolen car, police found a pile of stolen goods and an eerie collection of student ID cards with names. They were his trophies. souvenirs from a world he hated and so desperately wanted to be a part of, when the door of the patrol car slammed shut, and then the door of his cell in the Leon County Jail. The final act of Ted Bundy's life began. An act in which he was to battle not the police, but death itself, and lose. Chapter 6, The Final Mask, the prison in Florida, was unlike those in Utah or Colorado. Here they knew who he was. Here they looked at him not as a mysterious intellectual, but as a monster. He was placed on death row under constant surveillance for fear of another escape. It was here, awaiting the trial that was to be his swan song, that Ted Bundy began his last and most cynical masquerade. He realized that the innocent game would no longer work. The evidence was irrefutable. Fingerprints, witness statements, DNA, though the technology was still in its infancy. So he changed masks. From prison, he began a complex, multi-layered game. On one hand, he prepared for his trial, again acting as his own attorney. He challenged every piece of evidence, inundated the court with motions, tried by any means to delay the procedure. He still believed he could outplay the system, fool the jury with his rhetoric and legal tricks. On the other hand, he began cooperating with the investigation. Slowly, in fragments, he began to confess to the crimes, but he did this not out of remorse, but as part of a new strategy. He was bargaining. He gave investigators information about the burial sites of his victims in exchange for a stay of execution. He led them through the forests of Colorado and Utah, pointing out clearings and ravines where his terrible dramas had once unfolded. For the relatives, this was a torturous but necessary ritual to find their daughter's remains and bury them in peace. For Ted, this was a last chance to feel his power and significance. He was the center of attention again. Investigators, psychologists, prosecutors, they all depended on his words, his memory. He conducted their hopes and despair. He doled out information in tiny portions, stretching out the process, enjoying his role as the master of secrets. And finally, he found his last ally, Carol Ann Boone, a young, attractive woman who had come to Florida from Seattle. She fell in love with his image, his story. She became his common-law wife, his link to the outside world. Their relationship was a strange, painful dance of two lonelinesses. For Ted, she was proof that he could still be loved, that he could still possess a woman who reminded him of his former victims, but this time voluntarily. For Carol Ann, he was a mysterious, tragic hero whom she could save. In July 1979, the trial began. It was a media circus. Ted Bundy was on trial for the Tallahassee murders. He was again the center of national attention. He was brisk, trim, and sharp. He gave fiery speeches, cross-examined witnesses, and built conspiracy theories. But this time, the mask began to crack. At times, uncontrolled rage flashed in his eyes when things didn't go according to plan. He could be charming one moment and vicious and sarcastic the next. One of the most chilling moments of the trial was the appearance of a witness, the same Carol Da Ranch he had tried to kidnap in Utah. She again took the stand and pointed her finger at him. "That's him." Her voice was firm, and this time there was no doubt. The jury didn't deliberate for long. The verdict was predictable: guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced him to death by electrocution. Hearing the sentence, Ted Bundy did not flinch. He looked at the judge and uttered his first truly sincere words during the entire trial. "Thank you, Your Honor. That was very kind of you. Have a good day." There wasn't a trace of remorse in that phrase. There was only an icy, all-consuming arrogance. He played his role to the very end, the role of a man standing above the law, above morality, above death itself. The subsequent 10 years he spent on death row. He became America's most famous prisoner. He gave interviews, wrote manifestos, consulted for the FBI on the cases of other serial killers. As part of the VICAP project, he tried to analyze his own consciousness, explaining his actions as being due to pornography, society, anything but his own choices. He presented himself as a repentant sinner, a criminology expert, a victim of circumstances. But this was merely the last, thinnest, and most durable of his masks. A mask designed to hide from the world, and perhaps from himself, the simple, ugly truth that deep down, he was merely an empty, insatiable monster who never found anything within himself except darkness. Early in the morning of January 24, 1989, after all appeals and stays of execution, the masquerade ended. Ted Bundy was executed in the electric chair at Florida State Prison. His last words were to his lawyers and Carol Ann Boone's family: "Give my love to my friends and my family." He never asked for forgiveness from the families of his victims. He never looked into the eyes of the emptiness he carried within. He left as he had lived, an enigma wrapped in a mystery, a shadow that forever faded into oblivion, leaving behind only silence, pain, and an unanswered question. How could this have happened? He was a man with two faces, one turned toward the sun, promising light and warmth. The other turned toward the moon, bringing only cold and death. And until the very end, no one ever knew which one was real. Or perhaps there was no real one at all. Epilogue, the echo of the shadow. And so the voices in the courtroom fell silent. The final appeals faded away. The heavy prison doors slammed shut, and a special, thick silence settled in the death row cell, the kind that exists only in the pre-dawn hours, when the world holds its breath, awaiting a new day. But for one man, the new day never came. Early on the morning of January 24, 1989, the shadow was finally consumed by light, the merciless, artificial light of the execution of the sentence. Ted Bundy's death, like his life, was a public act, the final performance in a long tragedy. But with his last breath, the nightmare did not dissipate. It turned into an echo, into a question hanging in the air without an answer. So what is the moral of this dark story? Perhaps it is not in one simple lesson, but in several, woven into one bitter bouquet. First, and most importantly, evil wears the mask of normalcy. It does not come with fangs and claws, nor does it breathe fire. It comes in the guise of a neighbor, a colleague, a handsome stranger with a disarming smile. It speaks our language, shares our interests, hides in the very thick of our daily lives. The story of Bundy is an eternal reminder that the most terrible monsters do not live under the bed or in fairy tales. They live next door, and their most powerful defense is our unwillingness to believe that horror can be so close and so charming. Second, intellect without morality is a double-edged sword aimed at the heart of humanity. Intelligence, education, eloquence, these are all empty vessels if they are not filled with compassion, empathy, and an understanding of the value of another's life. Bundy was smart, very smart, but his intellect served only one purpose: to justify his own emptiness and satisfy his insatiable desires. He proved that a developed mind can become the most sophisticated instrument of destruction if it is not restrained by a heart. Third, an emptiness born from childhood wounds can grow into a monster. This is not a justification. Nothing can justify what he did, but it is an explanation. The feeling of rejection, the resentment toward a world that, as he believed, had deceived him, became the fertile soil in which the seeds of his dark side sprouted. This is a lesson for all of us about how important it is to protect a child's fragile inner world, how important it is to be honest and to give unconditional love, for an unhealed wound of the soul can in the future bleed onto the innocent. And finally, fourth, the system, however imperfect, is ultimately capable of confronting chaos, slowly with mistakes after many failures. The law, the perseverance of investigators, and the courage of the surviving victims ultimately triumphed. This gives hope. Hope that no evil, however intelligent and sophisticated, can forever escape accountability. Ted Bundy's body was cremated, and his ashes were scattered over mountains, the location of which is kept secret. There is no grave to visit, no monument, except the memory of his victims, bright, talented young women whose lives were cut short so cruelly and so pointlessly. Their names, not his, deserve to remain in history. Donna Manson, Susan Elaine Rancourt, Roberta Kathleen Parks, Lisa Levy, Margaret Bowman, Kimberly Leach, and many, many others. They were real. Their dreams, their laughter, their love, all of that was real. He was merely a shadow, briefly blocking the light of their lives. A final lullaby for the listener. And now, dear listener, it is time to let go of this heavy story. Allow it to slowly dissolve into the night, like smoke fading in the sky. You are safe. You are lying in your bed, under a secure roof, and outside the window the wind rustles quietly, not the ominous whisper of the past. Take a deep, slow breath, and an equally slow, calm exhale. Feel the weight of this saga leaving with it, giving way to the silence of your room. Listen to the rhythm of your own heart. It beats steadily and calmly, like a reliable metronome, marking the moments of your peace. Feel the warmth of the blanket, the softness of the pillow under your cheek. Your body is relaxed, every muscle grateful for the rest. Outside the window, perhaps a rare car passes, and its sound does not disturb, but only emphasizes the depth of the surrounding world. Or a raindrop falls, and its measured tapping lulls you to sleep like a lullaby. Close your eyes. Imagine you are looking at the calm surface of a dark lake. Only occasionally does a ripple run across it from a fallen leaf. And again, stillness. Perfect, deep, serene. The moon softly illuminates its shores, and you feel your thoughts, one by one, quietly drifting away along this moonlit path, disappearing into the distance. You have come a long way through this story, and now it is behind you. The shadows, the masks, and the echoes of an old nightmare are left behind. They have no power over you. They are just a story. Allow yourself to sink into the arms of Morpheus. May your sleep be deep and serene, like that lake. May your breathing become even and quiet. Nothing disturbs you. Nothing will break this precious peace. Sleep peacefully. The night carefully guards your sleep. Peace be with you, and pleasant dreams.